The annual Flaxborough Garden Fête was never supposed to be exciting. That, in fact, was its main attraction. The bunting strung between stalls, the trestle tables sagging under sponge cakes, the brass band gamely pumping through green sleeves, for the 50th year running, all of it promised an afternoon of gentle, predictable provincial contentment. People came as much to reassure themselves that nothing had changed as to buy raffle tickets. But this year, the fete found a way to make itself memorable, and not in the fashion anyone desired. It began when the raffle prizes, arranged on a long table by the bandstand, were ready to be awarded. The first ticket, drawn with due solemnity by the mayor's wife, corresponded to the grand prize, a heavy oak chest donated anonymously, said to contain household luxuries. The mayor beamed, a photographer poised his camera, and the winning number was announced. A respectable widow from the next parish shuffled forward, smiling shyly, to claim her prize. The chest was heaved open. What spilt out was not tinned peaches, nor a set of linen, nor even the customary bottles of sherry. Instead, half the town gasped as they saw a tumble of women's undergarments, silk, lace, and altogether more daring than Flaxborough society was accustomed to seeing even on washing lines. Atop the heap lay a velvet mask and a folded sheet of paper marked in bold strokes. Admit 2. The widow squealed, the mayor's face drained of color, and a ripple of laughter and horror swept the crowd. The band, unable to improvise, crashed out of its tune and collapsed into silence. By the time the chest was hustled shut and the widow carried off in tears, the fete had already shifted into scandal. "Someone's idea of a joke, mark me," muttered Mr. Boot, the ironmonger, shaking his head. "A joke? That was Mrs. Dalby's ticket. You think she laughs at scandal?" hissed the vicar's wife, tugging her shawl tighter. "Don't you see?" "It's a message," said Mrs. Bloxham, the stationer, eyes bright. "Those garments weren't new." "They were used rubbish," snorted Councillor Fledge, flushed and sweaty. "Probably stage costumes." "Yes, costumes for theatricals. Nothing to see here." "In my day," muttered old Green from the snug of the beer tent, "a mask like that meant only one thing: secret societies, meetings at night. You'll see the whispers tangle through the crowd, each version more elaborate than the last. Some insisted the items were evidence of an illicit affair. Others argued it was an attack on the mayor's dignity. Still others claimed it was proof of a decadent club meeting in the next parish. The fete continued in a brittle semblance of order, but every stall-holder was whispering, and every child was repeating words they scarcely understood. Inspector Purbright arrived discreetly, summoned by a flustered constable. He walked slowly between the stalls, his gaze calm, absorbing the crowd's nervous energy without comment. He allowed the chatter to brush against him like the breeze-lifting bunting. He did not stride toward the chest, but paused first to note the anxious flutter of the mayor's hands, the too-straight posture of Councillor Fledge, the way certain matrons clutched their handbags as though guarding secrets more valuable than coins. At length, he approached the table. The oak chest had been locked again, but the constable who had fetched him stood nearby with the paper. Perbrite accepted it, unfolding the sheet slowly. The words were bold, written in thick ink. Admit 2. The pavilion. Tonight. Perbrite turned the paper over. On the reverse, faint but unmistakable, a smear of lipstick marked the corner. He placed it in his notebook with care. Sergeant Love, who had been wrestling gossip out of a knot of matrons, hurried over. "Sir, you've seen it then." "Nasty business. They say it's an invitation, one of those, cabaret things." His ears reddened. "Do you suppose it's a prank?" Purbright's eyes drifted over the crowd. "Pranks are usually thrown, Sergeant. This was presented. Someone wanted an audience." Love frowned. "So it's a message." "But for whom?" Purbright glanced toward the mayor, who was sweating into his collar while trying to shepherd his wife away from the scene. That, Sergeant, is the question. One might notice that humiliation is as precise as a scalpel when arranged carefully. It cuts not just a person, but their company. He spoke the words softly, but those close enough to overhear carried them into the crowd within minutes. Already the theories adjusted themselves. Perhaps the garments belonged to someone known. Perhaps the mayor's family was targeted. Perhaps the anonymous donor of the chest was no benefactor, but a mischief-maker. Then, just as the fate began to stumble back toward normalcy, a second disturbance erupted. A boy, poking about behind the cake stall, had discovered a small wicker hamper hidden under the table. He dragged it into view and opened it before anyone could stop him. Inside lay more garments, this time bundled around a small envelope. The stall holder shrieked, the crowd pressed forward, and the envelope was snatched up before it could be tucked away. Purbright retrieved it from the eager hands of the crowd. Inside was a second note, written in the same bold hand. Admit to the pavilion, tonight, midnight. The gasp that followed was louder than before. If the first discovery could be dismissed as an ill-chosen prank, the second confirmed intention. Someone wanted this message seen, repeated, debated, and someone, perhaps, wanted an appointment kept. Purbright folded the note and placed it beside the first. His calm face revealed nothing, but his words, measured and faintly dry, settled the crowd into deeper intrigue. When invitations arrive unasked, one must ask who wrote the guest list and for whose amusement the party is given. The phrase spread like sparks in dry grass, repeated in the beer tent, the cake queue, and among the brass band players. Within minutes, it had become the town's new refrain: who wrote the guest list and for whose amusement? As Perbrite and Love prepared to depart, a councillor bustled up, red with indignation. "Inspector, this outrage must be stamped out. The fete is ruined, the mayor humiliated. You'll find the culprit, of course." Perbrite regarded him mildly. "Of course. But first, councillor, we must consider whether the culprit has already invited us to meet him." He tapped his notebook. "Tonight, at the pavilion." The councillor blanched, then muttered about scandal, but Purbright had already turned away, his gaze lingering on the wooden chest, the wicker hamper, and the ripple of whispers still darting through the crowd. He knew the fate would not soon be remembered for sponge cakes. And as the townsfolk dispersed with their theories, the question grew sharper in every mind. Who was behind the pavilion invitations, and what awaited at midnight? By late afternoon, the fete had resumed its outward smile, but it was a smile that showed too many teeth. Purbright and Love lingered near the bandstand, while the constable returned the oak chest to the committee tent. The mayor's wife had retreated to an obliging vicarage drawing room. The mayor busied himself with raffle books like a man trying to rearrange gilt into neat columns. The note in Purbright's pocket felt heavier than paper. They began with the practical. Who had handled the chest? A porter's lad, sleeves flowery from lugging scones, confessed to wheeling it in on a barrow that morning. "Came off, mister." "Goss's cart, sir. Said it was from the committee store." He pointed vaguely toward the cricket pavilion beyond the hedges. "We stack things there when it's wet." "Anonymous donors seldom deliver to their own storerooms," Perbrite murmured. He let the boy go and turned to the chest itself. The iron hasp bore a bright nick, recent, where a tool had slipped. Inside, when unfastened under more discreet circumstances, they found the silks bundled with a tidiness inconsistent with panic. Beneath the garments lay crumpled tissue stamped faintly with a pattern, a small daisy encircled by tiny dots, almost invisible unless one coaxed the paper against the light. Love frowned. "Not a shop mark, I know." "Nor a mercer's flourish," Perbrite said softly. "A seal, perhaps, from an office that values ceremony more than commerce." They pressed on with the hamper. The wicker was old but cared for, and on the underside a blurred stencil read, "PAVTEA." It smelled of tea leaves and talc, not groceries. There were 2 lengths of string knotted with identical, fussy loops. "The pavilion tea room," Love said. "Well enough. Whoever hid this didn't fetch far. Convenience is the politest form of laziness," Purbright replied. "Our mischief maker is local." They took a short and unhurried walk under the lime trees to the pavilion. Its white rails and fresh paint gave the impression of innocence. The broad steps had been swept recently, but a faint heel scratch remained on the top riser, a small crescent of red wax or rouge, too bright for mud. Perbrite drew a handkerchief and dabbed it. It left a blush on the linen with a pearly sheen. "Lip rouge," Love ventured. "Perhaps," Perbrite said, "or stage paint made to behave like it. Vanity comes in many grades inside the caretaker, mister." Keble met them with the aggrieved virtue of a man who has never forgiven the town for needing his keys. "No bookings after 6, he announced by way of welcome. "Not since the Friday dances, and not tonight." Neither Perbrite admired the keyboard on the wall, a tidy meadow of brass labels. One hook, upper cup BD, was empty. "Who has that, Mr. Keble?" "The committee." Cupboard with the flags and bunting and other things, his mouth compressed. "Mrs. Mallow has it. Chairwoman. And Mrs. Dalby sometimes. Mind you," he added, surprised by his own recollection, "Mrs. Dalby had a win today, poor soul." "Funny luck, that." "Very," Perbrite agreed. He drifted to the small office where a ledger lay open. The day's entries were neat, then a line where the pen had paused and made a blot shaped like a comma. Below it, in a different hand, was a penciled note: "Pavilion, midnight, tea urn off." Keble protested at once. "Not mine. I don't pencil. Don't trust it. Someone's been in here, Inspector, I'll swear." "Someone tidy enough to leave the book open as if it belonged there," Perbrite said. He closed it gently, and practical enough to remind themselves to turn off an urn. Romance seldom remembers kettles. Back on the veranda, the air carried a whiff of talc and something cheaper, a violet perfume meant to be ladylike. Purbright stood a while, letting the scents layer themselves. Then he noticed a small brass seal press on the office shelf, used for committee minutes. He tested it on scrap paper. A daisy within dots impressed itself cleanly. Love compared it to the tissue from the chest. Near enough the same. "Near enough to be near," Purbright said. "Our invitations are not foreign mischief. They sprout from a Flaxborough flower bed. They return to the fete to speak, with courtesy sharpened by purpose, to Mrs. Mallow, chairwoman of the Horticultural Committee." She was a stout woman whose bosom entered rooms before her convictions. "Anonymity for donors is common," she declared, bristling. "People prefer modest virtue to vulgar applause." "Modesty," Perbrite said mildly, "does not usually arrive in an oak chest and shed its secrets on a trestle. Might I ask who holds keys to the pavilion's upper cupboard?" "Myself," she said too fast, "and Mrs. Dalby for arranging flowers. Also, perhaps Miss Penny from the tea room. She minds the urn and the committee seal." "In the office." "Why?" Her chin lifted, then steadied. "Has something gone missing?" "Only innocence," Perbrite murmured. They found Mrs. Dalby in the church tent, taking tea with a steadiness that suggested courage by the cup. She looked up, eyes rimmed red. "Inspector, I never wanted a prize. I buy tickets to be polite." Her voice trembled, then firmed. "Those things in the chest, someone's sin, not mine." "Who packed the prizes?" Perbrite asked gently. "The committee, yesterday evening. We did it at the pavilion to keep away the flies. Mrs. Mallow checked the list twice. I tied ribbons. Mrs. Dalby's fingers made the ghost of a bow. Miss Penny brought the hamper for slices and cups. She's a good girl. She wouldn't do this." "Does Miss Penny wear violet?" Love asked, and at that, Mrs. Dalby blinked. "She does. Her aunt sends it from Spalding. Sweet as sherbet, The fellows at the cricket make a game of it. They next spoke to Miss Penny, who confessed to the scent with cheerful misery. I only dab it. Mrs. Mallow says it makes me noticeable and then tells me to be invisible. I fetched the hamper last night because we were short. That's all. I locked the tea room and gave Mr. Keeble his key. I never touched no chest. Her indignation had the ring of innocence. Too direct for guile, too weary for theatre. Purbright let the currents carry them back to the bandstand as afternoon slid toward evening. The crowd had thinned, but the talk had thickened. A verger swore a masked ball had been held in the pavilion in the 1920s. A grocer's boy insisted he'd seen a velvet mask in Mrs. Mallow's basket. Someone declared a pavilion subscription club that met on Thursdays to exchange recipes and wickedness. With every gossip, the invitations gained a new audience. Love, walking beside Purbright, exhaled. "It points at the committee, sir, then immediately points away. If the notes came from their seal, why expose themselves? Because it is not exposure, but spectacle," Purbright said, almost to himself. An invitation that everyone is allowed to overhear is not an invitation. It's a stage direction. They paused by Latherby's stationer's stall, where raffle books lay like hymnals. Perbrite asked, as if it were a trifle, whether any place cards or dance vouchers had been printed lately bearing the words, "Admit to." Mrs. Latherby brightened with professional memory. "Oh, yes. Only last week a small run. Special order, same bold type as the church bazaar tickets, but without numbers. For the horticultural committee. Mrs. Mallow said they were to be used for pairing partners in some game." "Did she collect them herself?" "No, sent a girl." "Violet sent, now you mention it." They walked away in companionable silence. The fete lights would soon be doused. The pavilion would darken into its own promise. Love glanced at the hedge brake that framed the pavilion path. "Midnight, then." "Midnight," Perbrite agreed. He tapped his notebook where the tissue with the daisy mark lay folded beside the notes. "And not merely to meet a jester, Sergeant. If our author writes both the invitation and the program, the midnight scene will not be an empty stage." As they turned, a small detail caught Purbright's eye. The oak chest's lid, reclosed in haste, had trapped a sliver of ribbon. Not scarlet, as Mrs. Mallow favored for prizes, but pale green, the precise shade of the committee's sashes worn only by officials. Snagged in the splintered lip, it bore a faint grease mark with the same pearly sheen as the rouge on the pavilion step. He lifted it free with 2 fingers and tucked it into his book. The fete, which had promised harmless ritual, had provided instead a trail woven from daisies, violet, talc, and a pale green thread that led straight toward the pavilion at midnight, and, awkwardly, back into the heart of the committee. Dusk filed the fete back into boxes and baskets, but it could not put away the talk. Lanterns winked along the hedges. The brass band packed their instruments with the furtive looks of men who feared a trumpet might repeat what it had heard. Purbright and Love returned to the pavilion by the lime walk as if they were merely making sure the gate would latch. Mr. Keeble, nettled by the day, met them with keys that clinked like principals. "You have the committee's permission," Purbright said mildly, which was almost true. Mrs. Mallow had given a stiff nod that could be interpreted as consent or fatigue. Keeble grunted and led them inside. The hall smelled of polish, talc, and faint steam. From the tea room, a heat lay over the counter that should not have been there at this hour. Love touched the urn's side and drew back. "Warm." "Someone boiled water for secrecy," Perbrite murmured. "Tea is an alibi that leaves a fingerprint." Keeble bristled. "I lock up at 6, he said. "Tonight I turned my back for 10 minutes for a squabble at the gate. Came back, door on the snib. I'll not swear the place was empty that whole 10 minutes. He handed over the small brass token that served as the key to the upper cupboard and looked offended by his own uselessness. The cupboard opened to bunting and flags, committee sashes wound like tame serpents, and boxes of printed ephemera. Purbright lifted a spool of pale green ribbon. Its color matched exactly the sliver he'd rescued from the oak chest. Halfway down the spool, a smear shone with a pearly gleam. He dabbed it with his handkerchief and held the cloth to the light. "I'll blush again, Sergeant." Love peered. Same sheen as the step. On a shelf lay a shallow cardboard tray of tickets, 24 "Admit to" cards in the same bold face Mrs. Latherby had described. They were pristine until Love lifted the top layer and found beneath it a thin dusting of violet talc. He sniffed, grimaced, and set them down carefully. "Miss Penny's calling card?" "Or someone who knows the town will call it hers," Perbrite said. He reached deeper and brought out a small black mask wrapped in tissue, impressed faintly with daisies. Another, identical, lay wedged behind a coil of bunting. Both bore the softest trace of that pearly rouge along their edges, as if they had been handled by fingers that would rather not be remembered. At the back of the shelf, a compact had slipped behind a stack of hymn numbers left over from past concerts. Its lid, mother of pearl, was engraved with 2 neat letters in a looped hand. H.M. Love raised an eyebrow. "Harriet Mallow?" "Or anyone with an obliging H&M, Perbrite said, though his voice had a courteous weight. He opened the compact. The grease inside was the same shy pink they had met on the step and ribbon. He closed it with a click that sounded almost like agreement. He replaced everything as it had been, minus a single thread of the pale green ribbon which he coaxed loose where the spool had snagged. Threads are impolite spies, but faithful ones. Then he crossed to the office ledger. Yesterday's page, neat with committee hands, ended with the odd pencil line they had noticed before. Pavilion, midnight, tea urn off. Purbright bent close and smiled, very slightly. The writer's T had been crossed low, the D's loop pinched, habits one tends to teach oneself in school and keep when one's name signs minutes. He closed the book gently. One hand keeps its own company wherever it writes. They stepped outside onto the veranda for some unhurried air. The cricket field lay empty, a wide green pause. From the hedge came the whisper of late talk and a cough that tried to pretend it was a bird. Love's eyes went to the pavilion clock. If midnight is advertised, we won't be expected before. Nor will we be invited, Perbrite said. But invitation and expectation are different hosts. He went back into the tea room, ran a finger along the urn's plug, and found, tucked under the lip of the wooden tray that caught drips, a folded card the size of a calling note. Daisy pressed the tissue again, and the same bold hand. Admit to, Pavilion, 10. He held it out. Love whistled softly. So there are 2 performances. Matinee and evening, Perbrite said. Our author is generous. Before leaving, he asked Keeble who, besides the committee, held sashes. Keeble, after rummaging his memory, allowed that 2 junior committee stewards had worn them for the prize queue, hopping about like maypoles. One, a butcher's apprentice named Colley. The other, a visiting cousin of Mrs. Mallow's from the flower tent, whom Keeble distrusted on principle as a stranger. They found Colley behind the coconut shies, nursing a bruised thumbnail and gilt, like a second bruise. At first, he offered only sulks. Then, under Purbright's easy silence, he remembered that last night, while flags were being counted, he had been sent twice from the pavilion to fetch more ties from the committee tent, and each time he'd met Miss Penny going the other way, carrying a hamper and smelling of violet as if it were armor. She was with someone, though, he added suddenly, brightening at a useful memory. Not Keeble. A woman, but I couldn't see. Had a sash on. They laughed. Said, he frowned with concentration. Tickets for 2 at the stroke of something. Could have been 12. Or 10, Love said. Back at the square, the fete leaked away into lanes and parlors where theories would steep. Purbright and Love stopped at Mrs. Latherby's for a final word. The stationer, pleased to have anything that might turn into evidence, brought out her order book. The Horticultural Committee took 50 Admit To cards, unnumbered. Collected by Miss Penny, signed for by Mrs. Mallow, if you please. They paid ready money. A lady returned this morning for an extra dozen, said some had gone astray. She pursed. A neat hand signed HM on the docket. They walked into the evening with the town's lamps pricking on like cautious stars. It wraps itself neatly round the chairwoman, Love said. Her compact, her initial, her key, her tickets. If she's the villain, she's been tidy about it. Tidy villains are the despair of tidy clerks, Perbrite said, but too much neatness is also theatre. Remember, our mischief is fond of audiences. They set their plan without fuss. Briggs would melt along the hedge by the pavilion steps. Love would be among the alders on the cricket side, close enough to catch whispers. Purbright would take the tea-room's shadow, where the urn's warmth had recently declared someone's presence. They would attend the 10 o'clock appointment. If no one played, they would remain for midnight's encore. He sent Love on, then lingered one last moment in the office to look again at the day's ledger. Between the penciled midnight and the earlier neat entries lay a faint smudge where someone had rested a hand, the imprint of a palm dusted with talc. He smiled, almost fondly. "Between you and me," he murmured to the ledger, as if it could appreciate dry jokes. "Powders are poor disguises. They settle exactly where one expects them." At 10 minutes to 10, the pavilion sat as demure as a wedding cake left on a sill to cool. The square behind them had quieted into indoor speculation. Flaxborough had withdrawn to watch through curtains. Perbrite took his place by the tea-room hatch. In the hush, he heard a tiny mechanical cluck inside the upper cupboard, then the breathy scrape of a cylinder turning. A waltz, thin and scratchy, floated out, the sort of tune that made couples remember they were couples. The door from the cricket side eased open, and a figure in a pale green sash slid into the room, drawing the mask from a pocket like a conjurer who wanted applause before the trick. The faint waltz rattled on from the cupboard, each scratchy note a reminder that someone had wound it with deliberate intention. In the half-dark of the pavilion, Purbright remained very still, the polite shape of a man who had all the time in the world. The figure in the green sash slipped further inside, closing the door as carefully as one might lay a child to sleep. A mask glinted in their hand. In the wavering lamplight, its blackness looked theatrical rather than secretive. Purbright cleared his throat gently. "Punctuality is admirable," he said. The intruder froze. For a moment, there was only the waltz and the sound of the river's distant hush. Then the mask was tucked hastily away, and the sash-wearer turned. It was Mrs. Mallow's cousin, the visitor from the flower tent. She looked no older than 20, bright-cheeked, her eyes carrying a defiance born of inexperience. "I thought," she began, but stopped when Purbright's mild gaze held her. "You thought the stage would be empty until midnight," he suggested kindly. But someone kindly printed an earlier performance. 10 o'clock. "Admit To." Her lips trembled into a smile that was half challenge, half fear. It was only a lark. Everyone takes the fate too seriously. We wanted, amusement. "Amusement," Perbrite repeated, tasting the word as though it were an unfamiliar fruit. And did Mrs. Mallow find it amusing when her name began to creep into these entertainments? The girl blushed, stammered. "She doesn't know. It was me and Collie. He said it would make the fete lively. We found the masks, and then—" Love appeared from the cricket field door, Briggs close behind. The girl gasped, cornered by uniforms. She dropped the mask, which fell with a faint sigh of fabric on the floorboards. Collie, the butcher's apprentice, was dragged in moments later from the hedge where Briggs had flushed him. His protestations tumbled out in a torrent. It were just fun. Only tickets and masks. We thought the crowd would laugh, that's all. We never meant trouble." His eyes darted, terrified, toward Purbright. "You don't think we—" "No, sir. No letters. No hampers. Just the game." Perbrite regarded them without anger. "Youth's mischief is noisy, Mr. Colley. It seeks applause more than consequence, but the hampers and the chest, those were not your work. Someone else has written this play. You are but understudies who wandered on stage." The girl bit her lip. "We only took what was already in the cupboard. Masks, tickets, ribbons. They were there." Purbright inclined his head, as though she had confirmed what he already knew. "And you found them prepared for you. That is the mischief-maker's generosity. They leave temptation where the young are sure to stumble." Love gave a low whistle. "So they're pawns. Someone stocked the cupboard, wound the waltz, and waited for children to provide the scandal." "Exactly," Perbrite murmured. He bent and retrieved the fallen mask, noting a faint trace of that pearly rouge along the inner seam. He placed it into his pocketbook. "Go home," he told the pair softly. "Sleep. And in the morning remember that theatre without rehearsal is seldom successful." Keble was summoned and blustered about keys, innocence, and the integrity of his lock. Purbright only nodded, his eyes never leaving the open cupboard where bunting sagged like tired conspirators. The compact with its pink rouge was still in place. Mrs. Mallow's initials still gleamed faintly on its lid. But now, the presence of the masks, the tickets, the tissue, arranged, waiting, told a clearer tale. Outside, the town's lamps glowed in the mist. Purbright and Love strolled back toward the square, their steps measured, their conversation low. Love said, "So, sir, if those two didn't set the traps, who did?" "Someone older, someone with enough sense to play the crowd like a fiddle." "Indeed," Purbright said. "And someone with access." Access to the cupboard, access to the tickets, access to the gossip veins of Flaxborough. This was not a prank, but choreography. The music box is proof enough. It was meant to play as soon as someone lifted the door, a welcome tune for guests who never knew they had been invited. They stopped at the square. It was quieter now, though the beer tent still murmured. The mayor had gone home, carrying his humiliated wife. Councillor Fledge lingered near the refreshment stall, bellowing denials to anyone who would listen. Bream had slunk away long ago, his neat hands wringing the air as though trying to erase initials from it. Miss Viner passed silently with an armful of rolled charts, her composure ironed flat. Purbright's eyes followed her for a long moment. Not all theatre is loud, Sergeant. Some prefer silence. The town waited for midnight, though most would not admit it. Curtains would twitch, whispers would multiply. At 11:30, Purbright and Love returned to the pavilion, stationing themselves more widely this time. Briggs waited at the riverbank, eyes sharp. Keble locked the main doors with unnecessary ceremony, then shuffled away, muttering. The minutes crept past. At midnight precisely, a shadow moved along the hedge. A woman's shape, upright, precise, carrying a lantern hooded with cloth. She ascended the pavilion steps, produced a key, and entered. The music box, wound again, tinkled to life. Perbrite slipped inside behind her, soundless. In the lamplight, he saw her clearly. Mrs. Mallow herself. She set the lantern on the counter, drew a pale green sash from the cupboard, and tied it with hands that shook just enough to betray rehearsal. From her bag, she withdrew another envelope, bold strokes on its face. Admit 2, pavilion, 1 o'clock. Perbrite did not move at once. He let Mrs. Mallow go about her midnight ritual as if he were an audience member granted a private performance. She placed the envelope on the counter beside the urn, smoothed the pale green sash across her bodice, and for a moment simply stood, listening to the faint scratch of the music box. Her face, normally a mask of authority, looked curiously unmoored, as though the act of dressing herself in symbols had stripped away her certainty. When Purbright finally spoke, it was with the same gentleness he might have used to correct a child's sums. "It is late for horticulture, Mrs. Mallow." She started violently, one hand flying to her throat, the other snatching at the envelope. "Inspector, you frightened me." "Scandal often arrives by surprise," he said, stepping forward into the lamplight. "But it leaves clues, and clues seldom keep curfews." Her eyes darted to the sash, the mask half hidden in the cupboard. "This is not what it looks like." "I was merely tidying." Preventing more nonsense, Love entered then from the cricket field door, Briggs at his heels. The room filled with the kind of silence that makes excuses collapse. Perbrite took the envelope from her hand. Its flap was unsealed. Inside lay another bold invitation. "Admit 2. Pavilion, 1 o'clock." Beneath the words, faintly, was a sketch of a daisy, identical to the seal impression on the tissue they had found in the oak chest. He held it delicately between 2 fingers. "And who, precisely, were you expecting at 1 o'clock, madam?" She stiffened. "No one. I meant to destroy it. I knew of the others. Somehow they found their way into the prizes, but I thought if I removed the rest quietly, the town would forget." "Flaxborough," Perbrite observed mildly, "never forgets. It merely files. And you, Mrs. Mallow, have filed yourself into the middle of this affair." Her mouth worked, but no words came. She sank onto a chair, the sash slipping loose. Love frowned. "Shall we take her in, sir?" "Not yet." Purbright folded the envelope into his notebook. "Mrs. Mallow is a gardener. She arranges, she prunes, but she does not sow a scandal so flamboyant. Someone else plants, she tidies. That is her nature." Her relief was visible, though she tried to smother it. "Inspector, you must believe me. I found those things in the cupboard 2 days ago, masks, tickets, powders. I should have told the committee, but I feared, well, you see what's happened. I thought to remove them quietly." "And yet," Perbrite said, "the more you removed, the more appeared." She buried her face in her hands. "It makes me look guilty. But I swear, I only wish to save the fate Perbrite let the moment settle. Tell me, who had the most freedom in the pavilion after hours? Who could return without raising suspicion?" Her answer came at once. "Miss Penny. She cleans the urns, sweeps the hall. Keble trusts her, though he grumbles, and she is light-footed. One scarcely hears her." Love shifted uneasily. "But, sir, Miss Penny's too young, too artless. She'd hardly mastermind." "Artlessness is often a cloak," Purbright murmured, "and Flaxborough prefers its culprits underestimated." At 12:30, they escorted Mrs. Mallow home, leaving Briggs to watch the pavilion. Purbright and Love returned to the square, where the night still hummed with quiet speculation behind lace curtains. A cat streaked across the cobbles. Somewhere, a door shut too quickly. They chose not to rest. Instead, Purbright sat in his office with a collection of clues spread like an untidy herbarium. Tissue pressed with daisies, violet talc dusted across ticket edges, a ribbon stained with rouge, masks with faint finger smears, and now the 1 o'clock invitation. He regarded them not as objects, but as actors on a stage, each awaiting its cue. Love, bleary-eyed, rubbed his temples. "It doesn't tie, sir. If Mrs. Mallow isn't the hand, why wear the sash? Why put herself at risk?" "Because she feared being suspected if she did nothing," Perbrite replied. "Fear makes people tidy in all the wrong ways." "Then Miss Penny? But she's too, well, obvious. The violet scent, the talc, the hamper, it all points to her too neatly." Perbrite closed his notebook. "Too neatly, indeed." which suggests a cleverer hand arranging props for us to find. As dawn paled the windows, a knock came. Briggs entered, hat in hand, face tight. "Inspector, there's been another business at the pavilion." "Someone's broken into the upper cupboard again. I saw light, but by the time I reached the steps, they'd gone. They left a heap of bunting on the floor, and this," he held out a folded card. It was another invitation, identical to the rest, but this time the words had been altered. "Admit 2, Pavilion, Dawn." Purbright's eyes rested on it, calm but intent. "So the play continues. Someone very much wishes us to keep watching the stage." He rose, buttoned his coat, and gestured for Love to follow. "We shall attend the dawn performance, Sergeant. And this time, let us hope the author cannot resist taking a bow." The town at dawn was a different creature, half asleep yet restless, its shutters drawn, but its curtains trembling with curiosity. Flaxborough liked to pretend it valued its sleep, yet more than one set of eyes watched from upstairs windows as Perbrite and Love crossed the square toward the pavilion. The mist hung low, turning the hedges into drifting walls and the cricket field into a pale, expectant stage. Briggs waited at the gate, stamping his feet against the chill. "No movement since I fetched you, sir." "Doors still latched. Cupboard's been rifled, though. I didn't touch anything after finding that last card." Purbright inclined his head, the faintest courtesy for vigilance. "Then let us see whether our author prefers sunrise to midnight." They stepped inside. The air still smelled faintly of violets and the metallic tang of the urn. The bunting lay tumbled on the floorboards like a collapsed tent, and from beneath it protruded the handle of another wicker hamper. Love bent, tugged it free, and opened the lid. This time there was no lace or rouge, only documents, folded sheets marked with neat committee headings, hospital fund subscriptions, prize lists, receipts from the stationer, and among them, incongruous as a wolf in a flock, another bold card. "Admit 2. Pavilion, Dawn." Love exhaled. "They're mocking us now." "Not mocking," Perbrite said softly. "Insisting. Each note is less an invitation than an instruction. Someone wishes to see whether we will follow through on every performance." As if on cue, a door creaked at the far end. The caretaker, Keeble, shuffled in, lantern swinging. He blinked at the hamper, at Purbright, at the papers strewn like autumn leaves. His mouth opened, shut again, then produced indignation. "I locked it. I swear by the cricket pitch, I locked it last night." "Locks do not deter those with keys," Perbrite murmured. He lifted one sheet, noting the initials scrawled beside a donation amount, F. Dalby. Another bore B. Bream. The initials matched the gossip, yet the hands were all different, some pinched, some sprawling. Too many signatures for one account, too many players for one game. At that moment, footsteps clattered on the steps. Miss Penny burst in, cheeks pink, hair untidy, eyes wide. "Inspector!" "I came early to sweep. Mr. Keeble's wife said the Fête litter was disgraceful. I never touched those things." Her protest sounded too rehearsed, her breath too quick. Love looked at Purbright expectantly, but the inspector only regarded her with mild interest. "Your punctuality does you credit, Miss Penny. But tell me, why come through the hedge rather than the front gate?" She faltered. Because it's shorter." Purbright smiled faintly. "Shorter paths often lead to longer questions." Before she could answer, Briggs called from outside. "Someone's running, sir." They hurried out to see a figure vanishing into the mist toward the riverbank, coat flapping. Briggs gave chase, Love close behind, but the fog swallowed all three. Perbrite, unhurried, walked to the hedge break and waited. Soon enough, Love returned, empty-handed, breath clouding. "Lost him, sir. Tall, quick on his feet. Could have been Councillor Fledge by the build." "Or someone who wishes to look like him," Purbright said. He gazed toward the river where ripples broke the mist. Chases are part of theatre too, Sergeant. The audience expects movement. They returned to the pavilion. The hamper of documents still lay open, but one sheet was missing. The page Purbright had examined with Bream's signature. Miss Penny stood pale and trembling. I never touched it. I swear. Perbrite soothed her with a small motion of his hand. Of course. You had no time. He folded the remaining papers carefully. Someone wished to remind us how easily a name can be plucked from a list and dropped in the river. By mid-morning, word of the dawn disturbance had already reached the town. Shopkeepers repeated it between customers, and the verger, solemn as if announcing a hymn, told his congregation that the devil himself had been invited to the pavilion. Gossip now names 3 culprits in the same breath: Fledge, Bream, and Miss Penny, each more guilty depending on the teller's prejudice. At the station, Purbright set the rescued papers to dry across his desk. Love hovered, restless. It's all smoke, sir. Notes, masks, hampers. Nothing solid. If Mrs. Mallow isn't guilty and Miss Penny's a puppet, then who's the hand? Purbright steepled his fingers. We must ask which of our players gains most when suspicion multiplies. Fledge's bluster serves him poorly. Bream's neatness collapses under pressure. Penny is merely convenient. Mrs. Mallow tidies until she looks untidy, but the one who arranges each act, who ensures discovery after discovery, is someone who enjoys performance more than outcome. A playwright, not a thief. Love frowned. Then tonight, what do we expect? Perbrite closed his notebook. If the pattern holds, Sergeant, another invitation, and with it, another act staged for us all. But even playwrights grow reckless when they see the audience leaning forward. As he spoke, a constable entered, holding out a fresh envelope delivered by a boy who claimed he'd found it under the church notice board. It bore the same bold strokes. Admit to. Pavilion. Dusk. Perbrite accepted it with a faint, knowing smile. The curtain rises again, Sergeant. And this time, perhaps, the author will not resist stepping from behind it. By late afternoon, the town hummed with anticipation as if the fête had been prolonged into an unsanctioned second day. Word of the fresh invitation had traveled quickly, embroidered at each retelling until dusk itself seemed less a natural phenomenon and more a scheduled performance. Shop shutters clapped down early, not in fear but in eagerness, for everyone wanted to be home. Curtains drawn just enough to allow a view of the pavilion field. Flaxborough might scorn theatricals in theory, but when scandal provided its own script, no one wished to miss an act. Purbright never hurried, strolled with love along the cricket field as the light faded. The mist of dawn had burned off, leaving an evening of still air and long shadows. The pavilion stood waiting, its paint pale against the lowering sky, as though it had decided to play its role without protest. Briggs was already in place at the far hedge, and 2 constables lingered at the stile that led from the churchyard path. Love muttered, "We're being led by the nose, sir. Whoever's behind this knows we'll come, and the whole town's leaning on its elbows waiting to see what we find." "Curiosity is a leash," Perbrite said mildly. "The trick is deciding whether one is the dog or the keeper." At the appointed hour, the pavilion's door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, carrying a lantern hooded with cloth. Miss Penny again, her small frame unmistakable, the violet perfume drifting ahead of her like a calling card. She paused by the counter, placed a folded envelope upon it, then fussed with the urn as though this were her natural duty. Before Love could move, another figure joined her. Councillor Fledge, puffing and blotched, muttered something sharp enough to carry. "This had better be the last of it. You'll have us both ruined." Miss Penny's reply was low, but Purbright caught enough. "It wasn't me. They said to leave the notes here. I only followed orders." "Orders? Whose orders?" Fledge snapped. She did not answer. Instead, she pressed the envelope flat and stepped back as if her task were complete. Purbright chose that moment to intervene. He moved from the tea-room shadows and spoke in his mildest tone. "So the stage is set again." Fledge started, face purple with shock. "Inspector, this is outrageous. You have no right to attend an invitation?" Purbright lifted the envelope. The bold hand once more declared, "Admit to pavilion, dusk. But someone very much wished me here." Love stepped in from the cricket field door, Briggs from the hedge, hemming them in. Miss Penny looked on the verge of tears, her violet scent cloying in the warm air. Perbrite examined the envelope under the lantern light. Unlike the others, this one bore a flourish at the corner, a looping P drawn with more pride than discretion. He turned it for them to see. "Who here writes their P's like peacocks?" Fledge sputtered. "Not me." "I've not written anything since the last election flyer." Miss Penny shook her head, mutely. Perbrite tucked the envelope away. "No, of course not. Pride belongs to someone who thinks themselves above suspicion, someone who believes initials can be shuffled like cards until guilt falls on anyone else." He turned his gaze on the two of them. "You, Miss Penny, were convenient. Your perfume, your talc, your errands made you a ready mask. And you, Counselor, have the bluster of guilt even when innocent. Together, you make an excellent diversion," Miss Penny whispered. "But I didn't—" "I know," Purbright said gently. "Puppets seldom write their own scripts." Before the silence could deepen, a noise came from outside, the clatter of hurried steps, then the unmistakable crack of a shutter banging against the pavilion wall. Briggs darted out, Love close behind, but whoever had lurked at the window melted into the gathering dark. Purbright, unhurried as ever, followed only as far as the veranda. He looked out across the cricket field, now silvered by the first stars, and said quietly, "The author watches his play from the wings. He will not show himself until the final act." They returned to the station with Fledge bellowing about injustice and Miss Penny sniffing into a handkerchief. Purbright remained serene. He set the dusk invitation beside its predecessors, the looping P winking in the lamplight. "Too neat," he murmured. "Too deliberate. One might almost think the culprit wanted us to notice the flourish." Love frowned. "So they're taunting us?" "Or teaching us," Purbright said. He closed the notebook with care, but lessons reveal more about the teacher than the pupil. By midnight, the town was still buzzing. The vicar claimed from his pulpit that very evening that immorality has set up its tent among us. The ironmonger swore he'd seen the mayor whispering to Mrs. Mallow outside the post office. Old Green, in the snug, declared it was all the work of a secret lodge of gardeners' guild men who wore masks for their rituals. Every theory was wilder than the last, and yet each clung to the initials, the masks, the tickets, as though they were sacred relics. Purbright, sitting by his lamp, listened to the town through the constable's reports, the gossip condensed like dew on his desk. He considered the looping P again, then set it beside the compact bearing HM. "Too many clues," he murmured. "Become their own disguise. The question is not who is implicated, but who arranges implication so industriously." Love asked, "And what happens tomorrow?" "The Fate Committee meets," Purbright replied. "And if our author is a true dramatist, tomorrow will bring the grandest performance yet." Morning broke with a brightness that felt at odds with the mood of the town. Flaxborough's gardens gleamed after the dew, yet their owners hardly admired them. Every doorstep conversation, every whispered exchange over milk bottles, circled back to the pavilion and its mysterious invitations. By the time Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love reached the town hall, the committee chamber was already thick with voices raised in indignation and nerves. Mrs. Mallow presided at the head of the long table, her bosom heaving like a bellows beneath its starch. To her right sat Councillor Fledge, puffed and red-eyed, determined to bluster his innocence before anyone had accused him. Bream hunched over a sheaf of notes, his spectacles misted with anxiety. Miss Penny, summoned to take minutes, perched on a side chair, violet scent surrounding her like a cloud she wished to escape. Purbright took his seat without fuss, folding his hands. Love stationed himself by the wall, notebook ready but expression skeptical. The atmosphere suggested less a committee than a rehearsal for melodrama. Mrs. Mallow opened the proceedings with severity. This committee will not be made a laughingstock. The Garden Fête, as always, stood for propriety, for virtue, for community. These exhibitions at the pavilion are intolerable. We must find the guilty party and excise them from our ranks. Councillor Fledge thumped the table. Here, here. And let it be known it's no councillor of my standing. I was dragged into this farce by insinuation and lies. Bream's voice fluttered nervously. Perhaps it is merely youthful foolishness, a prank gone too far. Prank? Mrs. Mallow snapped. Do you call a chest of indecency and midnight notes a prank? No, Mr. Bream, this is subversion. The room rippled with mutters. Perbrite let them roll until quiet settled again, then spoke with his usual mildness. Subversion it may be, but effective subversion requires design. The question, ladies and gentlemen, is not who was present at each incident, but who ensured discovery. The notes, the hampers, the invitations, each was placed to be found at the most convenient moment. Miss Penny shifted uneasily on her chair. Her pencil trembled above the paper. Mrs. Mallow shot her a glare sharp enough to cut ribbon. Purbright went on. The 10 o'clock performance gave us youths in borrowed sashes. The midnight act gave us Mrs. Mallow tidying what she feared would shame her. The dawn brought us papers spirited from the cupboard. Dusk paraded Councillor Fledge and Miss Penny together in the most compromising posture. 4 acts, 4 scapegoats, and yet the author remains absent. A hush followed, broken only by Fledge's muttered, "Rubbish." Love spoke then, his voice plain and steady. What the inspector means is that every one of you has been positioned to look guilty. Each new discovery comes too pat, too neat. Someone in this room is enjoying themselves too much. Eyes darted across the table. Mrs. Mallow glowered at Fledge, who glowered back. Bream nearly vanished into his handkerchief. Miss Penny dropped her pencil with a small clatter. Perbrite leaned forward slightly. One might ask, who benefits? The fate is disgraced, the mayor embarrassed, the councillors divided. Who gains by disorder among the tidy ranks of Flaxborough's worthies? Bream unexpectedly croaked, Not me. My whole life is figures and minutes. Disorder ruins me. Fledge barked a laugh. You? You've been scribbling accounts nobody reads. Maybe you cooked them, eh? Maybe these notes are your fancy way of hiding mistakes. Enough, Purbright said gently, yet the single word silenced them. We shall not accuse blindly. Evidence remains. For instance, the invitation we received at dusk bore a flourish, a proud P. That flourish is not Bream's, nor Fledge's, nor Mrs. Mallow's. It belongs to a hand that enjoys ornament. He produced the card and laid it on the table. The looping P shimmered under the gaslight. I should like each of you to write your name. Mrs. Mallow, stiff with indignation, scrawled hers with a square, uncompromising hand. Fledge scrawled his with such haste that his P barely stood upright. Bream's hand was trembling, pinched, small. Miss Penny hesitated, then wrote hers in neat school script. Her P was timid, without flourish. Perbrite compared them calmly. None matched the peacock curl of the invitation. He replaced the card in his notebook. Curious. Our author is not content to frame you. He prefers to use a hand none of you claims. Mrs. Mallow banged the table. Then who? Who in heaven's name writes these wicked notes? Purbright's gaze drifted, almost idly, to the sideboard where tea had been laid out. Among the cups sat a scrap of tissue stamped faintly with daisies. It had been used to wrap sandwiches, but bore the same mark as the oak chest linings. He lifted it gently. "Sometimes," he said, "answers present themselves in the margins." The committee dissolved soon after in angry mutters and defensive promises. Fledge stormed out, Bream scurried, Mrs. Mallow stalked, Miss Penny wept softly into her violet-scented sleeve. Only Purbright and Love lingered. Love leaned close. "So what do you make of it, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "That our playwright has a sense of humor. He plants his props not just in cupboards and hampers, but under teacups, and he cannot resist repeating himself. Daisies here, daisies there. A hand that delights in motif, like an amateur dramatist proud of his symbol." Love frowned. "But who?" Purbright rose, buttoning his coat. "Patience, Sergeant. The next act will tell us. A dramatist cannot resist a climax, and the more elaborate the play, the grander the final scene." That evening, as dusk thickened, Flaxborough's townsfolk buzzed with rumors of yet another performance. Some claimed the pavilion would host a masked ball that night. Others swore a bonfire was planned to burn the scandalous garments. Curtains twitched, doors bolted early, but the hum of expectation was undeniable. The town had become its own theatre, and Perbrite, walking slowly beneath the street lamps, knew the playwright of this scandal was preparing his most ambitious act. Evening spread itself across Flaxborough with theatrical flourish, the kind of twilight that seemed arranged by stage hands. Windows along the square glowed, curtains twitched, and every household carried its own whisper of anticipation. By the time Purbright and Love set out across the cricket field, the pavilion looked less like a building and more like a stage awaiting actors, its white timbers pale against the encroaching dark. The constables had been stationed carefully, one near the stile to the churchyard, another by the hedge break, Briggs at the river bank where the mist began to curl. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharper, paraffin perhaps. Love noticed it first and muttered uneasily, "Smells like lantern oil, sir." Perbrite only inclined his head. Lanterns are a favorite of dramatists. They show what ought to stay hidden, and they hide what ought to be shown. At 9 precisely, a light bobbed toward the pavilion. A lantern, hooded, was carried by a figure moving with deliberate calm. As it drew nearer, they saw it was Miss Viner, the clerkly assistant whose composure had until now been unshakable. She mounted the pavilion steps, key already in hand, and disappeared inside. Moments later, the waltz from the cupboard began again, scratchy and insistent. Love's eyebrows climbed. Her? I'd have sworn she was too stiff for theatrics. Stiffness, Perbrite murmured, is often another word for rehearsal. They entered quietly. Miss Viner stood at the counter, lantern placed beside her, an envelope laid flat under its light. She was writing, her neat hand steady, looping an elaborate flourish at the end of a bold P. When she turned and saw Purbright, her face did not falter, only froze into stillness like porcelain. "Inspector," she said, "you come everywhere, it seems." "Invitations are difficult to resist," he replied, lifting the envelope. It read, in the same bold script as the others, "Admit 2, Pavilion, midnight." Love exhaled. So it was you all along. But Purbright's tone remained mild, even courteous. "Not quite. Miss Viner provides the handwriting, yes. The daisies, the talc, the flourishes, they are hers. But the question remains, does she write for herself or for someone else?" Her lips pressed thin. "I'm not obliged to answer." "Indeed not," Purbright agreed. He held the lantern up, its light brushing the cupboard's contents. More masks, more cards, all neatly arranged. But the trouble with theatre, Miss Viner, is that an audience eventually demands a revelation. She tried to walk past him, but love blocked her. Briggs appeared at the doorway with a constable. For the first time, her composure cracked, a tremor in her hand as she adjusted her shawl. "Inspector," she said, her voice lower now, "you don't understand." Order must be maintained. The fete was falling into vulgarity, raffles, sponges, cheap entertainments. I wished to remind them of what happens when propriety is neglected. A scandal sharpens morals. Love looked astonished. "You staged all this?" "For morals." "Morals," she said firmly, regaining some of her poise. "When the town gossips itself sick, it will crave sobriety. When councillors are frightened of their own shadows, they will behave better. Disorder, Inspector, is the best teacher of order." Purbright regarded her for a long moment. "And yet you enjoyed it. The masks, the notes, the waltz at midnight. This was no simple lesson. It was a performance. You wanted an audience." Her eyes flickered. She did not deny it. At that moment, a sudden commotion outside broke the fragile stillness. Shouts, the crack of feet on boards. Briggs stumbled back in, breathless. "Sir, someone else was here." Another lantern, running for the river, gave chase, but he slipped into the mist. Perbright's gaze sharpened. He turned to Miss Viner. "And here is the flaw in your performance. If you were the sole author, there would be no need for accomplices lurking in the wings. So, who else writes in your hand?" She shook her head firmly. "No one. I work alone." But Perbright's voice, though calm, carried certainty. "Not alone. No dramatist can resist an audience, and no audience is enough without applause from the wings. Someone else profits from your theatre, Miss Viner. Someone who leaves you to be caught holding the pen while they vanish into the fog with the script." The constables escorted her away, still dignified, still insisting she had acted for the good of the town. But Purbright's mild eyes remained on the river, where the mist thickened and the water lapped softly against its banks. Love joined him, puzzled. "Do you believe her, sir?" "I believe she wrote what we were meant to read," Purbright said. "But belief in authorship is not the same as belief in direction. There is still a hand we have not seen, Sergeant, and until it reveals itself, this play is not done." Behind them, the pavilion creaked in the night breeze, the waltz having wound itself to silence. Yet the lantern's smell lingered, acrid and sharp, as though the stage waited impatiently for its final act. The morning after Miss Viner's arrest, Flaxborough did not awaken so much as stir uneasily, like a sleeper caught between dream and nightmare. Shopkeepers arranged their windows with deliberate slowness, pausing to glance at customers whose whispers carried more weight than coins. The vicar's wife spoke of a moral cleansing, while the regulars in the snug declared the whole business nothing but women's mischief, with Councillor Fledge loudly agreeing whenever he could be overheard. Yet for all the certainty paraded, nobody seemed convinced. Perbrite sat in his office, the window cracked to let in a thin shaft of watery sun. On his desk lay the invitations, bold admit 2 cards, each bearing its daisy motif or looping flourish. They were lined up as neatly as soldiers, yet their very tidiness betrayed the hand of someone who wanted to be admired. Miss Viner had confessed enough to tie the ink to her own pen, but Purbright's mind moved as calmly as the river. It was not the pen that staged the play, but the hand that directed it. Sergeant Love entered, hat in hand, face clouded with doubt. "She swears she acted alone, sir. Said it was her way of saving the fate's dignity. But—" He hesitated. "You don't believe her?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Belief is a word for sermons, not inquiries. I observe, Sergeant, and I observed a lantern running toward the river last night that was not hers." Love frowned. Briggs saw it too. A man, he thought. But it was thick fog. Could have been anyone. "Indeed," Perbrite agreed. And yet the fog chose to shelter him, not her. curious, is it not? Before Love could reply, a constable arrived with news. More papers had been found floating near the bridge. When laid out on Purbright's desk, they proved to be duplicates of the subscription lists, initials scattered like dice across columns. But one page carried something new, a margin note in the bold theatrical hand, not Viner's precise script. Finale. Pavilion. Tonight. Love groaned. So it's not over. On the contrary, Perbrite said softly. Our dramatist promises a climax. We should be grateful for such courtesy. All that day, the town buzzed like a hive. Children ran about, chanting, "Admit to," as though it were a nursery rhyme. Women clutched shopping baskets with sudden sharpness, as if to prove their virtue weighed more than groceries. Men at the pub swore the mayor would be forced to resign, that Fledge would step in, that Bream would be packed off in disgrace. The whole of Flaxborough seemed intoxicated by scandal, as though the play were more nourishing than their dinners. Toward evening, Purbright walked slowly through the square, Love at his side. Lamps were being lit, their glow blurring in the cool mist that had rolled back from the river. The pavilion loomed across the field, expectant, every shutter in town a watching eye. Briggs met them at the stile. "We've set posts at every side, sir." "No one gets in or out unseen." "Excellent," Purbright said. He paused, looking out across the damp grass. "Though remember, our author prefers entrances that seem accidental. Watch the river, the hedges, the roofs if you must. The more dramatic the reveal, the more certain he is to choose it." They entered the pavilion. The cupboard stood open, as though awaiting discovery. Inside, alongside the remaining masks and ribbons, lay a fresh envelope. Perbrite lifted it carefully. The same bold hand announced, "Admit all. Pavilion. Midnight." Love whistled low. "Admit all? That sounds like the whole town's been invited." "Precisely," Perbrite murmured. "A finale is only as grand as its audience." "Tonight, Sergeant, our playwright intends to draw back the curtain before every eye in Flaxborough." The plan was simple. Constables would mingle with the crowd that was certain to gather. Briggs would watch the river bank, and Love would watch the hedge. Purbright himself would remain within, silent, a part of the stage until the actor stepped forward. By midnight, the town had assembled, not officially, but inevitably. Men leaned on the railings, women stood in knots with shawls drawn close, children huddled despite scolding. The pavilion doors stood wide. Inside, lanterns glowed, casting long shadows across the bunting-strewn floor. The waltz tinkled from the cupboard once more, scratchier than ever, as if straining for its last note. Then came the footsteps. Steady, deliberate, from the riverside. A tall figure entered, lantern swinging, coat damp with mist. He did not hesitate, did not slink. He strode as though he owned both stage and audience. Councillor Fledge cried out, "There! That's him!" But his voice was lost in the collective gasp. The figure placed the lantern on the counter, drew from his pocket a final bold card, and laid it flat. "Admit all." The crowd pressed closer to the doors, every eye strained. Perbrite stepped from the shadows, calm as ever. "Good evening," he said. "We have been expecting you." The man's face, revealed in the lantern glow, was not Fledge's, nor Bream's, nor even the mayor's. It was Mr. Eltringham, the bank manager, his spectacles gleaming, his expression curiously serene, as though he had been waiting for his applause all along. The gasp that rippled through the watching townsfolk might have belonged to a theatre audience rather than citizens gathered in damp shawls. Mr. Eltringham, bank manager, a man of neat suits and fussy spectacles, hardly looked the villain. His lantern glowed on his careful face as if he were about to read minutes aloud rather than confess to mischief. Purbright did not rush. He walked forward with the unhurried calm of a man inspecting garden tools at a sale. "You have kept us entertained, Mr. Eltringham. 4 acts, each with a scapegoat." Miss Viner's careful hand gave us the daisy seals. Mrs. Mallow, fretting, supplied her compact rouge. Miss Penny, with her talc and violet, provided aroma and gossip. Councillor Fledge, ever blustering, needed only to stand in a doorway to appear guilty. And all the while, you arranged the stage. Eltringham smiled faintly, as though pleased to be recognized. "Inspector, you flatter me." "I am no playwright. I'm merely a banker." "Merely," Purbright echoed softly. He turned the last invitation over. The bold letters, the flourish, all precise. But bankers enjoy accounts balanced. "And you, sir, decided the town's morality needed balancing. You wrote scandal into the margins so that every upright citizen would stand accused. Love, bewildered, burst out. But why? What's a chest of garments, a heap of masks, these blasted notes?" Eltringham adjusted his spectacles. His voice was calm, cultivated. "Because this town is too smug, Sergeant. Its councillors, its committees, its raffles and fêtes all believe themselves unassailable. A banker sees arrogance daily, overdrawn accounts, petty embezzlements, signatures made without thought. I only wish to remind them that reputations are as fragile as ledgers. One bold flourish, one misplaced mask, and they crumble." Purbright inclined his head. "And you used Miss Viner's hand for your notes?" "Of course. She is precise, invisible, the perfect clerk." She thought herself tidying. In truth, she provided the ink. I provided the stage and the lanterns. They are symbols, Inspector. Light in darkness, shadow in daylight. The town wanted theatre, so I gave it theatre. Harmless in itself. No crime, unless one counts embarrassment. The murmurs from the door grew restless. Councillor Fledge shouted, "He's mad!" "Arrest him, Inspector." Purbright's gaze never left Eltringham. "But you overreached, sir." The hamper at dawn contained real documents, subscription lists from the hospital fund. That was no theatre. That was theft. For the first time, Eltringham faltered. A shadow crossed his face. "Borrowed, Inspector." Borrowed to show how easily such papers might be manipulated. No money missing, you'll find. Only the truth, displayed in a more dramatic fashion than usual. Purbright's voice remained mild, but each word landed with quiet weight. "You took them to prove your point, but when suspicion fell too close, you dropped them in the river. A banker should know that evidence floats." The townsfolk outside hissed and muttered, scandal now finding its true target. Miss Penny, peering through the door, began to cry. Mrs. Mallow's indignation rose like steam from a kettle. Bream dabbed his forehead with his handkerchief. Even Fledge fell silent, as though robbed of his lines. Perbrite closed his notebook. "Mr. Eltringham, you are correct about one thing. Reputations are fragile. But so too is order. You wished to remind Flaxborough of its own weakness. Instead, you reminded it that theatre without honesty becomes cruelty." Eltringham straightened, pride flickering again. "And yet, Inspector, I succeeded. Look at them. Every councillor, every committee member, every shopkeeper whispering. They will tread more carefully now." "Perhaps," Perbrite said, almost kindly. "But they will also remember that the man who taught them was not some foreign villain, nor a faceless conspirator, but their own banker. And trust, once withdrawn, is seldom redeposited." Love and Briggs stepped forward, placing firm hands on Eltringham's arms. He did not resist, only looked out toward the misty field as though imagining the applause of an invisible audience. The townsfolk parted to let them pass, their whispers swelling into a roar of fascination. Later, in the quiet of the station, Love asked, "Do you think he really believed he was helping the town, sir?" Purbright leaned back, folding his hands. "Belief, Sergeant, is the most dangerous currency. Spent carelessly, it bankrupts more lives than theft ever will. Eltringham believed he was a playwright and teacher. In truth, he was only a banker, balancing books that were never his to keep." The following week, the Fête Committee met again, chastened but intact. The mayor resumed his pomp, though with less strut in his step. Mrs. Mallow fussed over ribbons with renewed severity. Miss Penny, forgiven, swept floors without perfume. Miss Viner returned to her clerical precision, now watched with wary respect. And Flaxborough, with relief, turned its gossip toward gardening and harvest once more. Yet the story lingered. In parlors and pubs, children and elders repeated it, embroidered it, claimed they had seen it all. And in the quiet of his office, Inspector Perbrite allowed himself a small smile. Another performance had ended, another puzzle resolved, not with thunder but with patience. He tapped his notebook shut and murmured, almost as if addressing the absent banker, "Between you and me, mister. Eltringham, scandal makes fine theatre. But truth, even whispered, lasts longer." The river, indifferent as ever, carried its reflections onward.